Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to this evening's Empower Hour. My name is Mary Pettigrew, and on behalf of the Empower Our Future communications team, we are very excited that this evening is the first in our new Energy Frontier series. And as you all know, and I hope are excited to learn, we're going to find out what jet fuel, 1%, and common sense have to do with 100% renewable electricity. I'll go ahead and move into the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge with respect as non-native people that the land on which we stand, live, and learn is the traditional territory of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. We also recognize the 48 contemporary tribal nations that are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. We honor elders, past, present, and future, and those who have stewarded this land throughout generations. We also recognize that our government, academic, and cultural institutions and our nation itself were founded upon and continue to exact exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples. May this acknowledgement demonstrate a commitment to working to dismantle ongoing legacies of settler colonialism, oppression, and inequities, and to recognize the hundreds of Indigenous nations who continue to resist, live, create, and uphold their sacred relations across their lands. Let us seek to understand what it means to be in right relationship today with the traditional stewards of this land and this land itself, and with all the creatures that inhabit it. Tonight's speaker is a frequent Empower Hour guest, and we're very delighted to have him back. Ken Regelson has a master's degree in electrical engineering, along with 2+ decades of experience in modeling, analysis, and practice of a high renewables grid. For 5 years, Ken was a policy analyst at the State Capitol and Public Utilities Commission, representing Colorado's solar installers. Over the last few years, Ken has been working on key grid impact questions of high levels of renewables. Thank you so much, Ken, for joining us. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Mary. And thank you to the entire Empower Hour team that's helping put this on. It's been quite a process to get this talk together, and I'm very excited to be here. So I founded energyshouldbe.org about 12 years ago with the goal of abundant, secure energy for all and forever, no exceptions, to drive a rapid and responsible transition to a clean energy future. And it's all based on data-driven actions. I'm not interested in just talking about things. I want to actually analyze and model, and particularly modeling was just a key idea for us. Now, this is what my opinion of what energy should be. That is not the same thing as what energy will be. That's a much more complicated question. We're going to allow lots of time for Q&A, and we'll be going past 7 to allow questions and answers, but we will take a very brief break at 7 o'clock. And also periodically, you'll see things that say, Ask Ken. I had to cut this talk down from what I really wanted to give, partly because it was just too long. But if there are people that are curious about particular things, there are some things that you'll see that I won't address, but you might want to ask some questions about, and I'll have a summary of that at the end. So here's our topic list. We're going to talk about what's killing coal. It's partly renewables, but not mostly for now. That last 5%, getting above 95%, getting above 99%. How do we generate electricity enough to really keep the lights on? Fast, flexible generation and hybrids is one way to do that, but it does not solve all the issues that I think we're going to need. What's the role of hydrogen? E-fuels, that means fuels that are derived renewably from renewable electricity. That's where the energy inside the fuel comes from. Finally, actions you can take. And then, of course, question and answer. Now, when I first started working full-time in renewables in 2001, coal was king, gas was queen, and honestly, 10% solar and wind electricity seemed practically impossible. Every now and again, somebody would say, oh, hey, when we get to be 100% renewables, and there'd be a long pause, and then everybody would laugh. That was 2001. 2012, I created Energy Should Be to get the word out to people, to move people forward, and to look at this analysis question. And I put together a video that turns out to be our third most watched video. There's more than 12,000 views of this video. It's 3 minutes long, to allow lots of renewables. Baseload coal and nuclear must go. Problem is, baseload power plants run like this. Renewables are like this. And if you're trying to back up something that's going like this with something that goes like this, it doesn't work. It's now 2024, and coal is being killed by electricity markets where there's actual competition amongst generators, and lower cost combined cycle gas, and lower cost renewable electricity. And the fact that the price of gas went down, although it's probably not low right now. This is from EIA. It shows 2012 to 2023, this last year, as an estimate. And this is what happened to coal. It dropped from 40% to 20% of generation. You'll see that most of that was natural gas. Here's renewable solar and wind mostly coming up. So they became increasingly cost competitive, and they are starting to drive down natural gas, in addition to driving down coal, even a little bit more. In 2024, we have many utilities that have or are planning 80% plus renewable electricity. A few are close to 100% now, like Hawaii. This is Excel's plan. 2023, they're at 50% renewables. 50% renewables and 50% fossil. In 2028, they plan to be 80% renewable, with about 15% fossil. So let's talk a little bit more about coal, nuclear, and to a lesser extent, combined cycle gas. Combined cycle gas is a gas plant that runs a little bit like a coal and nuclear power plant, but not quite as slow. So they don't work well with renewables. I already talked about that. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. They have a high minimum run. That means you can't turn them down to way low. If this is 0, you can only turn them down maybe to 50% or maybe even 60% of their full capacity. They aren't very flexible. They can move a little bit, but they can't move a lot, and they can't move quickly. In the case of coal and nuclear, 3 or 4 days of start time. It takes a long time for them to get going and a long time to shut down. In case of a combined cycle gas plant, it's a slow start. It might take 12 hours or more to get up to speed after generation. Coal and nuclear are very high capital costs. And what's more, it's not just that. They're very high cost unless they're run most of the time. If they're running at 80 or 90% of the year, then they're not so bad. Part of that's capital costs, the cost per building them, and the cost that we pay off to Excel for running them. And that is, if you don't have lots and lots of megawatt hours, a way of measuring electricity, you don't have lots of those in the year, you're spreading out this big cost over a small number. That makes that cost higher. And then it turns out they have high staff costs. In the United States, it's an average of 54 people to run the average coal plant for the United States, which is 300 megawatts if you're one of the people that are detail-oriented on this call. And note that there's no nuclear in Colorado at this point in time. This is really critical, and it doesn't just apply to coal and nuclear. It applies to combined cycle plants. If you don't run them a lot, they're not cost effective, although they don't, combined cycle, you might need 1 or 2 staff people to run them. But it might also apply to geothermal, very high upfront cost and not very good at moving up and down. Or small modular nuclear reactors might have the same issue. Ask me questions at the end for more detail. With apologies to W.C. Fields, the actor, he actually said, what the world really needs is a cheap 5-cent cigar. Well, I don't smoke and don't believe in it, but hey, I get the point. What the world really needs, this is me saying, this is a good, cheap, medium start, somewhat flexible and reliable generator. Let's talk about above 95%. Now, these slides are from a talk I gave, I think maybe even to Power Our Future in 2019. And it talks about what happens when we model lots of reliability and how we get above this 5% level. So first, the story that goes behind this. Now, dark calms, what are those? That's when there's no sun and there's no wind, or little sun and little wind. And we want to be able to have electricity at okay cost. So we took actual data from Platte River Power Authority. That's an electric utility that serves 4 northern Colorado cities with generation and transmission. 95% renewables. This is just showing 7 days, which we picked because of this giant dark column here. And it includes already big storage in the modeling. These orange dropping points below 0, that's where there's not enough renewables and not enough storage of what we already have. And these, think of these as slot canyons, and here's the Grand Canyon. To fill these slot canyons, it's actually, you don't have to add that much more storage to be able to fill these slot canyons. To fill this one, you have to add a lot of storage, which only gets used once, maybe every year or twice a year, or maybe once every couple of years. And when you have something that costs a lot of money, a lot of storage costs a lot of money, you only use it once or twice, that's a problem. That's the story. Let's show it again a completely different way in a chart. So what we did is we started by modeling 85% renewables, electricity, and this is hour by hour, no storage, grand, small storage, big, very big, ginormous, and you can see what happens to the renewable levels. Surplus. This is a lot of surplus, and you have heard me talk, some of you have been following me for years, and say that we need to get the curtailment, the surplus down. You know what? I can't take the time right now. Doesn't take a long time, but there's a lot of points I want to get to first. But curtailment is not as much of a problem as we originally thought. Thank you, Ron Sinton, for that thinking. Okay, this is the amount of storage it takes. 500 gets you up from 85 to 90. That next 5% takes 4 times as much. That next 4% takes 6 times as much. And this takes a lot more to get up to that last little 1%. This is what it looks like graphically. This is what we added to get from 99 to 100%, this giant amount of storage. And here's the utilization. If you use this 500 megawatt hours for 266 times a year, that's pretty good utilization. You get to spread that cost over a lot. But this giant area, you're only going to use that a couple times during the year. I know it says 10 here, but this will only actually be used a couple of times. That makes it a giant cost. You have to do something different. So we notice there's this sweet spot. Somewhere maybe it's 97 or 98%. I'm not exactly sure where it is. We can model it, but modeling, you have to have more data than we have to say what's most likely going to happen. And what we need above that point is not just tons and tons and tons more storage, but something different. Maybe it's Form Energy's long-term storage or some of the other companies that are working on long-term storage. Maybe it's surplus electricity to maybe a liquid fuel. More on that later. Or maybe it's taking used electric vehicle batteries that still have life in them, not so good for transportation, and use that. I don't know. Let's look at this 500 and what that really means in the physical real world. So here we go. Here's that 500. Here's 47,000 megawatt hours. That happens to be 94 times this number. Here is a storage container, a shipping container. And it turns out if you take a shipping container and fill it full of batteries, right now you get about 2 megawatt hours. It's going up. Maybe it'll get to 3 or 4 at some point in time. There's 2 megawatt hours. There's 20 megawatt hours. There's 500 megawatt hours. Okay, imagine this times 94 times, and I think you start to see the problem with this. What about 1%? What is 1%? 1% of a year is about 100 hours. For those of you that are literal, it's less than 88, a little bit less, about 4 days. 1%, well, that's the distance from here to here. 99% to 100% renewables. Form energy, interestingly, Form Energy's definition of long duration storage is 100 hours, 1%. And they did that by getting lots of utility data and saying, how much storage do you really need to have very high levels of renewables? This is a chart, I'm sorry, it's an eye chart, but it's from Excel. And it talks about their gas combustion turbines, their peaking units, the ones that can go very fast, not their units that run kind of like baseload. And you'll notice that most of these are below zero, if you can even see them at all. There's only one generator here for these 3 years that are above 1%. This chart went quite a bit further, but it's not very meaningful for our discussion. There was one other little point. There's one of these doesn't belong. Cherokee 4 is not a combustion turbine. Right? I mean, it is sort of. It's a long story. If you have a question about it, ask me at the end. It's kind of an interesting story, I think, but I'm a geek. What can you say? Okay, so we know what 1%'s about, but something that we don't want is, oh, I'm sorry, a little off here. So renewables and storage push fossils to 1% and less. Even if you're at 80%, but you know you're heading down a different level, 17% down, and then you add a little bit more storage, a little bit more demand management, some more renewables, maybe markets help you out, you're going to be getting closer and closer to 1% not renewable. What about another side of 1%? A 100-hour blackout is not acceptable, particularly if it happens to be during a 110-degree heat wave or a minus 10 degrees cold snap. Picture the last several days in Colorado with no heat, no light. And if we electrify it, no transportation. People die. And our economy literally stops. You can't buy anything during a blackout. Everything relies on electricity. That's not acceptable. Maybe an hour is acceptable, but not 100 hours. So how are we going to fix that? Efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. I've said it. I've mentioned this in every talk, and people say, why don't you talk more about efficiency? Absolutely, efficiency. What makes the lights go out from the generation side, from the grid side? It's failure, like a mechanical failure, or insufficient planning for generation, transmission, and distribution to meet our load. Load is all the ways that we use electricity at this moment. That's the electricity load. And I'm mostly going to talk about generation. So let's talk about sufficient generation. These next two slides are actually from the talk I created back in 2012. So enough generation to keep the lights on 99.9%. That's 1 hour blackout plus 20%. And that's because if you're an electric utility, your neighbor may fail and you need to be able to help them. That's part of the way that we get to this level of blackout, to this lower level, 99.99%. Recently, as I said before, that means baseload, coal, nuclear, gas for running like baseload or sort of like baseload, like a combined cycle, and peaking gas. And that looks like this. This is, by the way, actual data from 2010 for Boulder, Colorado. And this shows a fair share of what baseload coal, no nuclear in Colorado, and peaking natural gas to fill in. That's what it looked like in 2010. But if we add wind and solar to even just 30%, never mind 50%, 30%, the wind looks like this, the solar might look like this. There's no place for a big rectangle. If you try to put in baseload coal and nuclear, it just doesn't work. And you have to go to something that's very nimble, going up and down, like a peaking gas plant. Okay, I think very soon, sufficient generation is going to mean for utilities, renewables everywhere, storage everywhere, distributed energy resources, that's down in our buildings, on our homes and businesses, solar storage and load management so that we can turn down the load when we don't need to use it so we can keep air conditioning and heating running and transportation. Virtual power plants, these are all great things and they are coming. Managed electric vehicle charging, and part of that could be V2G, where not just charging the vehicle, but the vehicle helps support the grid by exporting electricity to the grid, and continued backup support from neighboring utilities, maybe through larger market areas. And even with all of that, we may still be faced with a 1% shortfall. Two choices. We can ignore it and say 1% fossil's okay. Or maybe we can do something else, and maybe there's some things we can learn about doing something else. That's the rest of this talk, most of the rest of this talk. Okay, one of the things we can do is to take things that are less efficient than they could be and make them more efficient with flexible generation and hybrids. Platte River Power Authority, Northern Colorado, their plan is to get to 88% renewables by 2030. Not as much as we might like, but it's still a good big step. And they say they need a 200 megawatt, $240 million aeroderivative gas turbine. They're going to close their 280 megawatt coal plant. That's why they need this additional capacity. More wind and solar distributed energy resources. And they want firm, fast, flexible, fast start, low minimum capacity replacement for the coal capacity. And by the way, highly efficient. Okay, I agree with the first five. And I wonder why highly efficient matters as we move from 12, then down to 5, and then down to 1% non-renewables. Efficiency doesn't matter so much if you're just going to run it for 1% a year. They are keeping 388 megawatts of existing gas turbines. And I agree, they need 200 megawatts of firm capacity somehow. But there are lots of ways to get that, not just an aeroderivative turbine. Okay, firm, fast, flexible, fast start, low minimum capacity. Priuses. The Prius was an amazing innovation when it first came out back in 2001 or 2000. It has a relatively large gasoline engine in comparison to a very small battery. Actually, in comparison to bigger cars, it does not have as big a gas engine as them, but in comparison to the battery that's in it that helps move the car, not the battery just for lights, but that actually helps move the car, it's a pretty small battery. And that got a big improvement in gas mileage and a big reduction in pollution. What if we did that with this? This is probably maybe 100 megawatt natural gas electricity generating turbine, a peaking unit, one that can vary very quickly. That's what it looks like. You can tell from the steps, it's not giant. That's a lot of generation in a pretty small space in comparison to like a coal-fired power plant. This is a schematic. This is from EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute. This is the research and innovation arm of the electric utilities. It's not the only innovation they do, but but Excel belongs to them, sends them money so they can do innovation. Platte River Power Authority, lots and lots of electric utilities give money to EPRI to do reports. And they published this report in 2021. And it basically said, we should convert all of the gas turbines that are out there, the thousands that are out there in the world, to hybrids. Because you get firm, reliable, dispatchable better than the existing turbine. Okay, and why? Well, that's because you can run the turbine or just the storage or just the turbine, or you can run both at the same time, and you can switch on the fly. The battery gives it super fast and flexible capability. It's cheaper to maintain. Black start capability, that's something that a lot of power plants don't have. And with hybrid systems, you can add in black start pretty inexpensively. Spinning reserves with a lot less spin and pretty inexpensive, $15 million for a 50 megawatt CT. That's a lot of money if it was me, but in utility speak, that's not much. Think of them as firm spinning reserves with 90% less spin. There's 4,000 megawatts of these in the United States, right? At the end of 22, there are probably more now. In 2023, a company named Wellhead that provided a lot of help in answering questions and understanding these to me, by the way, a 50 megawatt existing peaker gas plant. And they got data from April 1st to July 31st, and from 2022 before, and 23 after. And it showed reductions of starts by 62%, run hours of the gas turbine 86%, and reduction of gas use 90%, and also reduction in pollution of about 90%. because you're just not spinning it as much. When you spin, you use gas, you make pollution, and starts are very expensive for reliability, for maintenance. So I've got about, I think, 12 minutes more of speaking to do, just so you know, not too much more. CAISO is California's grid operator. They say, not just me saying this or Wellhead saying, they say that all these things, black start, ancillary services, capacity on a shared interconnect, anything a spinning gas turbine can do, these can do with very little spin. FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, that regulates on the US level, the national level, electric utilities, said you can use a fast track interconnection process for converted turbines. These are available not just from Wellhead, they're available from GE and Mitsubishi as well. There's a report. If you want the link, then Mary or I can get it to you. Just send an email. You'll have my address. You probably have Mary's already. That helps the more technical people understand really what's going on this. So we'll see about that for a little bit later. So firm. Converting their 388 megawatts doesn't get them firm. And they still need it. And this is absolutely true from WC Fields. And ask me about the few alternatives that I see for firm capacity as we think about it now. Okay, what role hydrogen? These slides are brand new. Some of them are literally from this morning. I wish I could say that I was more prepared all the time. Okay. Why am I talking about this? Because a lot of people talk about hydrogen for aviation fuel. I don't think it's going to happen. Maybe I'm wrong. You tell me what you think after you see this. 787, nice, modern, great jet, 250 passengers. Turns out it's not that hard to find out the passenger cabin volume, 16,000 cubic feet. And you're going to see where I'm going with this in a minute. If you took the entire passenger cabin and made it a big tank, it would be about 120,000 gallons. There's 5,000 feet in the cargo volume, and they use 34,000 gallons of jet fuel. They can filled up with that. Okay, let's look at hydrogen for just a minute. We'll talk about other fuels too. Fuel oil is very similar to jet fuel, which is similar to some kinds of diesel. Not exactly the same. There's some significant differences, but they're all about 135,000 BTUs, a unit of energy, British thermal units, per gallon. Liquid hydrogen, nasty stuff, minus 423 degrees Fahrenheit, very close to absolute zero in the temperature of space, has about 27,000 BTUs per gallon as a liquid. And that's as dense as it gets. There is no getting hydrogen any denser than that. Doesn't happen. Not directly as hydrogen. That means to have the same amount of energy, you have to have 4.5 tanks of the size of the 34,000 gallons, which is conveniently just about the entire passenger cabin. So if you want to fuel this plane with hydrogen the way it stands, no passengers, no problem. Well, maybe a little problem. What about pipelines and storage? And let's talk about realistic uses, because I think there are some. It's these super cold liquids, like liquefied natural gas is super cold. They're really hard to cope with. You constantly have to cool them in order to keep them a liquid. They want to boil off, and that means you're losing that liquid. And we're talking about using it 1% of the year here, right? I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. This is for aviation. You can use a lot more than that. Pipelines need 4.5 times the capacity, either pressure, diameter, or both. There are environmental issues. This is a study from the UK. There's a link down here, and the slides will be available to you too. That said the leakage of hydrogen will increase the atmospheric lifetime of methane. We don't want that. Where is it good to be used for? Well, when it's being used to produce using electricity as the fundamental, but make the hydrogen with electricity that's generated renewably for steel, making steel, for making cement, or for making e-fuels, like maybe jet fuel. This is a quote from Leslie. Physics, including thermodynamics, always wins, but sadly, it never gets votes or gets elected. And that's why we're seeing so many people talk about hydrogen for things that are unrealistic for it. Here's the rest of the aviation fuel alternatives. Anything below the red line is just too energy undense. It's not dense enough to be replacing jet fuel in most jets as we think of them now. Maybe someday somebody will figure something different. LNG is a liquid fuel, and the tanks are just too heavy and expensive to make any sense. Make an e-jet fuel. Propane has its problems in ethanol too. If you want to know, ask. Okay, what about if we used lithium batteries? Never mind the weight, just the volume of them, how much space they take up. Well, turns out it's about 1,700, I can't see the numbers, I remember, it's about 5,000 BTUs per gallon. It's just a fraction of this. You have to have a tank that's 23 times as large as the tank that you would need to fuel an airplane this way. I do think that aviation, that electricity, will see it for short haul airplanes. And I also think that we should hybridize all the rest of the fleet eventually. That it'll make a great deal of sense to do that, just like it makes sense to hybridize a Prius. Okay, let's talk about 1% electricity fuel alternatives. These gas turbines, thousands of them worldwide, they burn fossil gas, most of them. Some of them actually burn fuel oil. Remember, that's just like jet fuel. Many are dual fuel already, and almost all of them can be converted to be dual fuel or just fuel oil, particularly if it's a renewable e-fuel with minor modification. Tank size, it doesn't matter quite as much. So that's not an issue. But even so, if you have a 100 megawatt gas turbine, that's going to burn 500,000 to about 1 million gallons of fuel in 100 hours, or 1%. And Colorado might need 50 to 100 of these. Now, it's still possible. Most of you, I'm sure, will recognize an aerial view of the Suncor refinery near Denver. This tank right here is probably about 5 million gallons. And there are tanks for fossils that get up to 26 million gallons. So we can do that. Okay. LNG, it just takes too much energy to keep it liquid. Although there are proposals for doing that, particularly if you're talking about 1%. If you're running it 90% of the time, well, it makes sense. Maybe. I don't think so, actually. I really think this is a good choice here. Let's make e-jet fuel and use it for electricity. So let's talk about e-fuels. Yeah, we started over here. What does it take to make this? Oh, actually, all of these can be made with carbon and hydrogen. In the case of ammonia, nitrogen and hydrogen, oxygen for the alcohols, and finally, electricity to make all of this work. This is, I think, what's going to happen. Okay, how do you make it? Mostly carbon, hydrogen, electricity. They're long chain hydrocarbons, hydrogen and carbon, long chain hydrocarbons. Where are we going to get the carbon from? Well, we can do CO2 air capture, except it's hard, which means expensive, and takes lots of energy. And it's measured in parts per million. That's why it's hard. There's so little of it in a giant quantity of air. But hey, fermentation generates almost a pure stream of CO2. Pretty easy to capture, but is there enough? I don't know. Carbon from biochar. Easy to create. Wood chips, when they're collected from, like when there's a spring snowstorm and all the branches drop and the cities collect up all of the wood and chip it up. That can easily be made into biochar. I don't know if if the cities have that many wood chips that we could do that with, but there are other places that we can get biochar from. And the hydrogen, of course, from electrolyzing water. Okay. We're coming down to the end here. I know I'm going to run just a few minutes over my, oh no, actually I'm not running over because we didn't start right at the head of the hour. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about these two industries, aviation and electricity. Aviation, it turns out we know how much jet fuel they use per year in quadrillion BTUs. This is a pretty easy number to look up. They use 2 quads. It's a giant amount of energy. 1% of all the electricity, this is just the United States, 1% of all the electricity for the United States is just a third of a quad. So aviation uses 6 times as much fuel as 1% electricity if we were just using jet fuel or fuel oil, which is very like it. There's some other things we know about these industries. The aviation industry, thousands of existing planes that are jet fueled. But if you change to something else, you may have to change the plane significantly. Wildly competitive, very innovative, very price conscious. That's why they're competitive. And safety and reliability are absolutely critical. Like the electric industry, reliability and safety are critical. There are thousands of existing generators in the electric industry that can be jet fueled. They are a monopoly. They don't have competition. There's minimal innovation, and honestly, that's not necessarily a knock on the utilities. To keep the lights on, I want minimal innovation, yet somehow the aviation industry manages to innovate pretty well and keep the planes pretty darn safe. Most are profit conscious, not necessarily price conscious. Some are price conscious or both profit and price conscious. Okay, if I'm putting my money on something, I'm going to go with the one that's using 6 times the amount of fuel because it's a bigger market and is wildly innovative. There it is, the aviation industry. Let's do what they're going to do. They need jet fuel. They know it. Sustainable airline fuel. We need to get it to be an e-fuel that's fully renewable. Okay, actions you can take. I love this quote. 3 in 4 say they'd prefer to date an electric vehicle owner. That came from a survey that Ford did as they were introducing their electric vehicles. Okay, so if you don't already own a plug-in vehicle and you can afford it, and there are lots of them available used now for pretty reasonable money, you should buy one. And the reason is not because maybe your 10-year-old car needs to be replaced right now. It's because people do what their neighbors do. Even the people that disagree with each other eventually get sold on the idea of what their neighbors are doing, disagree politically. If you have an existing home, or even if you rent, you can get an energy audit. That should include a blower door, an infrared camera pictures, and a report that lists cost-effective measures and do the cost-effective measures. Most of those are efficiency, about energy efficiency. Keeping your house warmer will make your house more comfortable, will make it better value to sell, better value to own. If you're a renter, get the report. Sometimes they're even free from the electric utilities. Get the report and show your landlord and say, look, why don't we set up, I'm signed up for a year, let's do a cost share. The savings, the computed savings, I'm willing to have half of that added to my rent. See what they say. Remove the gas meter. Your hot water heater, not such a big step. Just replace it with an electric hot water heater or a heat pump, either way. But space heat's tough in our climate. But space heat with heat pumps is possible if you can afford it, or it's new construction, do a ground or geothermal heat pump, same thing. If you have an existing home, you can still do an air heat pump. And I did a talk for this, and we can get you the link of the most recent one. But I did this for Empower Our Future back in December of last year. No, I'm sorry, December of the year before. And then in January, I did it for another group and actually had data from the cold snap that occurred in December of 2022. Let's review. Coal is being killed mostly by natural gas, by combined cycle gas plants up to here, and then increasingly being killed and stay killed by cheap renewables. And it's by cost that happened. We need firm generation that isn't super expensive. It doesn't have to be super flexible. We need to fill the dark columns at an okay cost. And there's a sweet spot here, but this is kind of impossible. That 1% what that means, and 1% blackout is not okay. 0.01%, 1 hour blackout's okay. We know what sufficient generation means. It means renewables everywhere, storage everywhere. We know we can get better use of our gas turbines as they stand for a much better price than buying them new. Buying them new would probably be 4 times, 5 times the cost of doing the conversion. We know that hydrogen isn't going to work as an aviation fuel, and neither is storage, battery storage. That hydrogen is not such a good choice for 1% electricity. And we know a lot about the aviation industry versus electricity industry at 1%, and that just makes a lot more sense to hitch our star to the competitive industry. And we know some things we can do for our own homes. There are so many people that I should thank for this talk. I'm going to just pick a couple. Leslie Glustom for so much. One of the big things for everything that I have talked about for the last 10 years is with regard to modeling. Leslie was the first person that said, there are smart people in Boulder. Some of them are pretty smart anyway, and that we can do the modeling ourselves. Ron Sinton, who said that the sun doesn't stop shining at noon. That's actually the name of his comments to the Public Utility Commission on the clean energy plan that you can still make comments on. Ask me about that if you'd like. Lyle Rupert came on the scene about 3 years ago. He's been sucking data down from Platte River Power Authority so that we could see hourly data. They know about it. It's totally okay by them. And doing very interesting analysis and very thoughtful about how he looks at the world and energy. And by the way, in the daytime, he's a aerospace engineer. Mary Pettigrew for hosting this for so many years, and all of the Empower Our Future team. And Mary also because she helped create the energyshouldbe.org logo for me back, oh gosh, 12 years ago. Glenn Crummell is a good friend. Oh, by the way, Mary's a dancer, so is Glenn. Occasionally, Ron has been known to show up dancing. Glenn is a retired US Navy fighter pilot. He and I had a fascinating conversation of why existing jet fuel is good, why fuel oil is good, and why we want to stick with something like fuel oil. But I think he might have some additional things. Here's how you reach me, Ken at energyshouldbe.org, or email Mary and she'll be happy to connect us. And I'm happy to take emails. Sometimes it takes a little time, but the best way to reach me is by email. And with that, here are some of the questions that came up that you might want to ask some about. And with that, we'll take questions. And I think I probably ought to stop sharing my screen, huh?
Well, thank you, Ken, for a mind-expanding talk. That's terrific. I love that information. And it's obviously stimulated some thought. First of all, by Leslie, she asked, please discuss the energy return on energy invested for making jet fuel from renewable electricity.
The answer is that there are multiple steps involved, and each step takes additional energy. So anytime this is thermodynamics, right? And the answer is we don't actually know because it's not being done very much. But I'll tell you that taking and adding hydrogen to fuels and making more complex fuels is done all the time at the refineries. And they figured out how to do it pretty cost effectively. Do I know exactly the energy return on energy invested? No. But I know that we're not going to stop flying jet airplanes. It's enough of our greenhouse gases that we'd like to get it down. And I know that we need that 1%. So the answer is, I don't know. If somebody is interested in helping me research that, I'd be very happy to get that answer. But it's not going to be fantastic. The point is, we don't use tons and tons of it, unlike we do with, say, natural gas.
So Leslie has yet another question, and why isn't Platte River thinking about hybridizing their gas turbines?
Partly it's because it's relatively new, even though there might be 4,000 gigawatts. They may not have known that. I had to go look for that information. That didn't just jump out at me and say it was there. They had a big study done by Black and Veatch, and Black and Veatch did not include that, we think. They didn't give us the study, so we don't know. There's a lot of effort being spent at at Platte River Power Authority by advocates to move things. And if you live in any of those cities, Longmont, Fort Collins, Estes Park, or Loveland, and you're interested in being connected to those advocates, you can contact me and I'll be happy to connect you, or Leslie, or any one of a number of people.
Great. Next question is from Chuck, and he asks, how important is it that battery storage be co-located with a gas turbine, as in a hybrid, if both are connected to the grid?
The answer is that it is not mentally important, but it's the interconnection that matters. And the interconnection is what FERC and CAISO pay attention to. If you have the battery connected someplace else, that battery interconnection might fail independently of the gas turbine. And from their standpoint, when they're talking about managing, balancing the grid, they need that storage. But it's not a lot of storage to make a hybrid. If it's a 50 megawatt turbine, 16 megawatt hours of storage, which is not as much as it used to be, is about what it takes to drive, to make the turbine a hybrid. And so it's not a giant amount. So you can keep your giant amount that's out there, and you can use the battery independently of the gas turbine. But to count it as firm, reliable, it needs to be at least most of the way charged.
So Nat says, hi, Ken. Nat here.
Hi.
Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and insights. Very valuable. You share, we can do it, and based on current tech and modeling, we can get it done. Without a nationally focused strategy to hit the sweet spots, won't we see haphazard, ineffective blundering in the US to get there?
The old blundering, yes. Of course we'll see blundering. You know what? I've finally come to the conclusion that we don't actually do very much that's intentional. We muddle through. And when you muddle through, you make a lot of mistakes. You know, it's like Winston Churchill said, in the dark days of World War II, which in Britain were pretty darn dark, he said, you know what? He said, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've done everything else.
So I have a question of my own here, and that is, fill in your knowledge about curtailment. It always upsets me to hear that we go to this trouble to build all this renewable generation, and then they don't use it. So tell me a little bit about that.
So, Ron, I've been very unhappy about curtailment, and I've had to modify my thinking on it. And Ron Sinton pointed this out to me, and he said, look, Ken, it's not just the curtailment, it's the price. And he said that solar is so cheap in comparison to solar with storage, which we have numbers from Excel of what the costs are associated with solar plus storage and just solar alone. The solar is so cheap on its own that it is worth curtailing maybe even up to half of it to not have to do storage. In other words, to overbuild the solar for certain times of the year. Now, we don't like that. I don't like that. When solar was expensive, the most expensive electricity on the grid, that honor now belongs to nuclear power. When solar was so expensive, then curtailment just drove me crazy. But that's no longer the case. New solar is one of the cheapest forms of energy that we can put on the grid. It just doesn't happen when we exactly want it. So that's the short answer. Did that make sense?
We'll see if there's a follow-on. Made sense to me.
Okay.
So Chuck again is asking, green hydrogen is expensive as it is capturing CO2. So e-fuels are likely to be very expensive and will consume a lot of electricity. How about pushing to replace the many short flights in the US with a high-speed electric rail, as is prevalent in China and the EU?
So the EU and China both have their own special cases. They're both highly populated, and we're still, large parts of the country are relatively unpopulated. So to connect places in Colorado, it's pretty expensive to do. It's not impossible with rail. It's not impossible, but it's pretty expensive. We're actually seeing where the cost of subsidized rail in Europe is more than the cost of short hop airline flights. And that's because they pack them in. They pack people into the short haul airline flights. And the jets have gotten more energy efficient. So it's not as simple as that. But yes, there's no question that the cost of e-fuel will be higher. Right now, it's a lot higher, but that's because it's brand new. And anything that's brand new is a lot higher cost, and the cost will come down. How much will it come down? Most people seem to think that maybe we'll get to 1.5 or 2 times the cost of existing fossil-based jet fuel, and that we'll be able to do that reasonably well when we get the scale up high enough. The key thing to understand about renewables is that in the summer, when it's really hot, and the winter when it's really cold, we don't have very much. We don't have enough to go around, not yet. And that dark calms, if they happen when it's really cold or hot, that's a problem too. But in the rest of the season, and the spring and fall, we have all kinds of surplus renewables. Okay? There are times right now where Excel in the Colorado, the area that Excel balances, I don't want to say what balancing authority is. If you know what it is, great. If you don't, ask me a separate question. But which is much of Colorado, but not all, maybe 2/3 of the population of Colorado, I don't know the exact number, is covered by this report that Excel shows. And we can see that it's 4,000 megawatts of wind that will come on, run for a little while, and then drop off pretty quickly. And that's part of this, why we need fast and flexible to back it up. And you can see the coal plants running. We can still see about 1,000 megawatts of coal. And what happens when there's lots of renewables, and we're getting up to 2,000-3,000 megawatts of solar when it's sunny, not so much in the winter, but in the spring and fall, lots of sun. And you add those up, and it's more than what the grid needs. And so we are either curtailing it or selling it to other people. And a lot of it's getting sold. Well, I'd rather we use it ourselves personally. We're somehow citizens of Colorado end up paying for that, although when it's sold, it does cut our electric bill. So it's not as simple as that. But we want to keep this in mind. There's so many factors that balance out. But if there's all this surplus, remember, I was modeling 30 and 40% surplus, even into the 99% renewables case. That surplus is mostly at certain times of the year. That's when we want to make the e-fuel and store it. When there's abundant surplus renewables and there is so much available capacity for wind and solar, it's unbelievable, but we have to be able to use it to pay for it, even if it is pretty darn cheap. Kind of a long answer, and it's not as simple as some of the graphs I did. The ones that I show you that make really short, fast sense and are simple, some of those take days to produce, just so you know.
Great, thank you. We have the next question from Alan. Can you explain what the utilities in Hawaii have done to approach 100%? And what might you say about Holy Cross Energy and its goal of hitting 100% by 2030?
Yay! That's for Holy Cross and for Hawaii. Okay. They are very seriously moving forward and figuring it out. And how are they doing it? Well, some of it is by load management, by working with their customers so that they use electricity when the renewables are going and when we also have charged up storage. And they figure out ways to help people not use it the rest of the time. They are figuring out that you can do lots of renewables. I don't know if they figured out something, call it baseload solar without storage. That's a concept. And if somebody wants to know about that, ask. Okay. I don't know if they've got that one figured out or not. It's such a foreign concept that I'm not sure that anybody but Ron Sinton has figured this out. And I'll pass it on with Ron, giving Ron credit. And I'm sure other people have too. I know there are other people that have. But you take and you do efficiency, you push efficiency as hard as you can. You decide, I'm going to do this. That's why Hawaii has done it. And Hawaii has the advantage that everything is imported. And the cost for gasoline and for any of the fossil fuels is very expensive because partly they don't use that much. okay, even though they use some. And the legislature has said doing this, and by the way, they're an island. If we lose the West Antarctic ice sheet and it melts into the ocean because it's not floating, so it actually will raise a lot, that's 200 feet. Goodbye Oahu, goodbye most of the populated areas of Hawaii. And they know that, and they see the impact of rising seas and more intense storms. They're motivated. And it's very mild in Hawaii. So you don't tend to get super duper hot or super duper cold, except in very small areas, very small population areas. Holy Cross, it gets really cold there. They're just decided they're going to do it. And the people in the Holy Cross territory have said, do this. And they've got really great leadership that's helping out. And that's what we need everywhere is really, really great leadership. If Holy Cross can do it, any utility in Colorado can do it. Get on it, guys. I know you're going to 80%, but I want to see 100% by 2030 or maybe 99%. I'll settle for that.
Great. So I have,
And gals.
there's one more question as we approach the end of the Empower Hour, and it's from Nat. And he says, do you have or know someone who does have a sense that the recent clean energy funding legislation is funding hybridized gas turbines development and use above others, like compared to other recent investments like carbon capture and sequestration or hydrogen manufacturing and storage, like the Utah project?
Yeah. Okay. So carbon capture and storage is, it's just you're fighting physics and it's hard to fight physics and win. And it's just going to be expensive. And the fact that you can dump enough money on it to make it work doesn't mean it's a really great idea. There is, and so you're talking about the IRA, the Investment Recovery Act. And you know what? It's politics. To make politics work, they call it the sausage factory. It's not pretty what goes into it or making sausage, but sometimes it's tasty. To get the legislation passed, they had to compromise and make everybody happy. And so they did the best job that they could. And so they're funding a lot of things that don't make sense. They're funding a lot of hydrogen. I will say that they got something right in the proposed rules for the hydrogen, and that's that it has to be demonstrated that the electricity that's being used is renewable on an hourly basis. None of this year-long average nonsense. You can say where I am on this topic. This is fantastic because it will push everybody to doing just that on an hourly basis. That's the only thing that matters. You can average all the RECs you want and you haven't done anything. If you're still burning 30 or 40% coal, but claiming that, yeah, because I can buy these things real cheap that are just pieces of paper, that I'm actually powering my people, the people and my customers with renewables. Got to be hourly. Doesn't have to be better than hourly. That storage will take care of.
Great. Thank you, Ken. And I'm going to turn it back to Mary to conclude the hour. And we may go into overtime if there are additional questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Ken. And I am very honored to be acknowledged. Appreciate the nod. And of course, we are so happy to have you as a guest and hear from you. And we really appreciate that you're willing to stay a little bit longer.
On to any more questions if there are any.
There are. Bill asks, over $1 trillion of private capital was invested in clean energy tech last year. Is new technology to help with 100% renewable is just around the corner?
So the answer, let me tell you a little bit of a story that actually helped me put in the lithium battery against for the airplane case, and to show just how kind of wildly off it is. And that's a nanofuel, nanotechnology fuel. And it's particles, little particles that like to dissolve in water. That's okay. At pretty high density, that's okay. They're man-made, they're nanoparticles, truly, that can take a charge and lose the charge and the same way that many flow batteries do. So flow battery is I have 1 or 2 or 3 big tanks, and you make it bigger, the capacity, how much energy it stores. You make it bigger, I said capacity, wrong word. How much energy it stores by making the tank bigger with more of this, whatever this fluid is, in the case of a nanofuel. And then there's an expensive part, and then the fuel itself has got to be relatively cheap, and they think they can make the nanofuels relatively cheap. And the expensive part is the converter, the part that gives you capacity, not the amount of energy that you store, the megawatt hours, but how much electricity you make, the megawatts. And that's the expensive part, but that you can have a giant tank and just run all day long, or multiple days, 100 hours, by making the tank bigger, and tanks are pretty cheap. Okay, they said nanofuel, and I said, cool, they must be able to get higher density. And it says in the article, we think we can get to twice the energy density of lithium-ion batteries. And I said, oh, that's pretty cool. I wonder if we could use that as an aviation fuel. So I went looking for what the volumetric, how much BTUs per gallon we would have, and I did the math on it. And it turns out that it's not much better than, first, even if it's double lithium batteries, it's still a problem, because it's still not 23 times, it's 11 and a half times. It's still too big a tank. It's impossible. You have no passengers, no space for passengers. You have to make a giant airplane to do nothing, basically, to fly. Well, that's exciting, but it's not going to work for that. Doesn't mean it wouldn't make a great on-the-ground e-fuel, because it's fully rechargeable and it's closed cycle. I love the research. What stage is it in? Very early. Okay, they have a small maybe it's 2 or 3 small units manufactured. How long is that going to take to get commercialized? And by the way, lithium-ion batteries keep getting better and better. They're going to run into a wall where physics says they can't go beyond. Sometimes we find ways that don't violate physics that kind of walk around this. We've been doing this with computers for years, where we find different ways to approach the various problems. But the answer is, these investments, they're great. Some of the investments are going directly into mass producing what we need, renewables, storage, what have you. And some of the investments going into more far-fetched stuff. I love research. I think research in small modular reactors is great, because if we want to get to the outer planets, and maybe Mars is an outer planet, we will need nuclear power. That makes sense on Earth, where there's tons of cheap renewables, and where the small modular reactors can't run like this, which is the only way they're cost effective. They can drop to 0, but that means you're not running them, which means you're not making money off of them, right? So, okay.
Great. Couple more questions from Chuck, and I'm going to give you one at a time here. So
Thank you.
NREL modeling has included the possibility of storing green hydrogen in salt caverns for long duration storage needs. What are your thoughts about this?
I'd love it for local use, because you don't have to ship it around. And what I think is that we find places where there's salt caverns that can store a lot of hydrogen, and put our steel and cement plants there, and our e-fuel plants there, because e-fuel is easy to ship around. We got lots of pipelines that'll move e-fuel very efficiently, but hydrogen, never going to move it efficiently. It's not, it's just hard stuff to mess with. And we can't send it as a liquid, which is the only way that's even close to being dense enough to be interesting. Whereas fuel oil or jet fuel, we can put that in a pipeline and ship it all day long, all around the country. Every now and again, we spring a leak. We could work on that. Is it, are the salt caverns great? Yeah, they're big empty spaces, and maybe we can actually make them work. Maybe we can. It'd be nice to have had a lot of history with them. I know we've had some, and we store natural gas in salt caverns, and some natural gas has some hydrogen in it, native hydrogen. That I don't know what the leakage rates are. I don't know anything about how they really work in real life, and what issues will high concentration hydrogen do in there. Should we try it? Yeah, we should absolutely try it. Monitor the heck out of it. And if it works, let's take and move electricity, which we can move efficiently, to the salt cavern, make the hydrogen when there's lots of renewables, store it so that we can make steel and concrete year round.
So Chuck's second question. Also, NREL modeling of the national grid shows a need for seasonal storage, not just for dark, calm periods. But don't you see any, but you don't see any need for that in your Colorado modeling, correct?
So when you get up to high enough renewables, the modeling that we've done, which is not as sophisticated as NREL's, but also NREL wasn't shooting at a 99%. I don't think. Maybe I was. Maybe I'm wrong. Chuck might want to come on and debate me as far as that goes. But I don't think either one of us really wants to get on a date. And I'm kind of tired, so it wouldn't be totally fair. But you know what the heck? He's got giant amounts of background and information on this. But I believe that they didn't look at the idea of using lots and lots of storage. And I don't think that it occurred to them to use the e-fuels in the fashion that I've been talking about, or that they make so much perfect sense with the equipment that we already have. Or that. Do I know that? No, I absolutely do not know that.
So Chuck also says, thanks for an excellent presentation, Ken. And I think that goes for all of us. Thank you. I see no further questions. And Julie, do you have a comment?
Hi, thank you. Thanks for the great presentation, Ken. I would love to listen to this at a slower speed. But we got through a lot of stuff.
Which you can do with the video.
Great. Yeah. I have a question that's pretty basic, and that is, it relates to curtailed solar. And I have talked with Ron about trying to understand curtailed solar. One of the things I'd like to understand is what are the problems with using curtailed solar for amassing storage for use at night when renewables are not consistent?
Yeah, so that's in fact what we are doing is when we have surplus electricity from renewables, from wind and solar, we take and we'll be putting them into batteries and using them at night. And in fact, that's even starting increasingly in various places where they're starting to see some pretty big sized batteries. And the more batteries you have, the more you're able to do that. The problem is the expense of the batteries. And yes, the price of the batteries is dropping very fast as we mass produce them for electric vehicles, where then the utility industry gets to take advantage of those lower prices for their storage, for their electricity storage. There's lots of things that we can do, but there comes a point, and I don't know where it is, maybe it's 95% renewables. I'm not sure. There comes a point where it doesn't make sense anymore to do it that way. You need to think differently. Differently might be Form Energy, they call it a rust battery, where they think they can get the price down low enough that it'll actually make sense for 100-hour storage. Bless them if they can do it. They don't have anything bigger than, I don't know, a megawatt or something like that. I don't even know if that plant is running yet. They have plans for 10 megawatt plants, and we need hundreds and thousands of megawatts of capacity in order to make this work. Colorado, I don't know, 8,000, 9,000 megawatts peak. So that's the problem, is we need some way to think about it differently. And it may be transition, you know, it may be that we finally figure out something, I don't know what, that allows us to instantly grab onto all the CO2 that we want and make all the e-fuels we want. Maybe that's a use, I hate to say it, for the small modular reactors, except that I think there's so much surplus renewables that when we get to even the percentages that we're at, there's an awful lot of surplus renewables, and the percentages that people are talking about are even higher. And we need to think about how best to use those. And that was kind of one of Ron's point, is this idea of making firm solar. When you bid into markets, electricity markets, there are two basic electricity markets. There's more to it than this. But one is day ahead, and that's where you commit. You're saying that I can produce this power for sure. And if not, you're going to penalize me in some fashion. Okay? And then there's hour ahead. An hour ahead is called an imbalance market because it's impossible to perfectly predict exactly what's going on. And so you might have, for example, surplus renewables, and you might try to sell it to somebody else that could turn down one of their natural gas turbines to a lower level and buy this. And that's hour ahead, or it's actually in Colorado, it's being implemented as a 5-minute market, but it's typically called an hour ahead market. That's just historical on it. Okay, so the commit, that's where the big bucks are, is when you do it the day ahead. That's where you're providing capacity. That's where the big expense is going to be. And that's where the value can be. And solar, traditionally, you couldn't possibly think of it as being firm. But it doesn't, it either does not have to be, it certainly does not have to be, should be. But it may actually be possible to say that I know that I'm going to have firm capacity between these hours, not for the full 24, but during these hours. So if it's daylight, I'm looking ahead a day. I see it's going to be a wonderfully sunny day, and I've got a 100-megawatt solar farm, just 100. Don't worry about the megawatts. That's the total capacity. I'm going to bid in 50 megawatts into the day ahead market and get the big benefit from doing that. And the way I'm going to do that is I know I can see from modeling that I am so certain that I'm willing to take the risk of a penalty if I don't deliver, that during these hours, 10 to 2 or 10 to 3, that I can provide 50 megawatts because I have 100, and I know it's never going to go below 70. Okay. So I'm safe. I even have a 20 megawatt head above. And that 50 megawatts, that might be worth more than trying to sell the surplus on the imbalance market, on the hour ahead market, where you get less money for it. It should be able to burn to be firm capacity. Same with the wind. If we predict it, there's a penalty in the proposals for Colorado's electricity, full electricity market. If you don't make it, that will keep you from bidding when you shouldn't. And why can't solar bid in? And when I mentioned to this somebody that knows a lot more, I should mention Bill Alphouse's name. And Bill knows a lot about the utility industry. He was in the utility industry for quite a few years. And he said, "You're never going to sell this to the utility people." And I said, "You know, I never was able to sell them on the idea that baseload's going to go, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of it. And it's still cost effective in the United States and increasingly the rest of the world. So call it patience for this, but somebody's got to say the idea first. As soon as you say it, maybe people don't know where it came from, or they figure it out themselves, or something like that. But people start to think, they start thinking about it. And that's what we need, is people to think outside the box for that last few percent. I hope I answered your question.
Okay, I have no
You're
other-
muted, Julie.
Go ahead.
I'm back. Ken, I know you're running out of steam or electricity or whatever, but I don't know how much you were referencing distributed power, and what could we be doing, virtual power plants, or what could we be doing with more distributed power to help solve this problem?
Okay, so what I tell people that are looking at buying solar for their home or business is go with storage. It's time to start doing that. People stepping up for the very least, make sure that the installation is storage ready, because storage makes your solar much more effective. And frankly, there's getting to be enough solar on the grid in Colorado that most of the solar generation that you have, if you generate it in the middle of the day, is going to be surplus. And surplus is not as much value as it was as it used to be. Excuse me. And that, so storage is part of it, and part of it is this idea that what drives the cost down. I don't say install storage no matter what. I say install solar and storage and buy an electric vehicle if you can afford it. If you want, everybody should continue to install storage, solar with storage if you possibly can. And the reason is because it continues to drive the price down. It continues to show other people that we can do this, if you have a sunny roof. Don't do it if you don't have a sunny roof. And that's why the other reason why electric vehicles, we need to be buying them. It's because it is imperative that the manufacturers see that people want these. And your one or two vehicles, that's what drove the price of solar down, was when individuals installed it on their roofs. That brought the first price decreases, serious price decreases to the solar, and got it just cheap enough that in some cases, maybe a few utilities could do it, or a few bigger users, and that dropped the price some more. And people kept installing it on the houses, and that dropped it some more. And finally, it got to be cheap enough that it was completely competitive. That's what will happen with electric vehicles, will happen with storage, if we possibly can. To get that last percent, we may have to do something different. That's what this talk is about. And I am running out of steam. Julie is another giant in this. Steve Whitaker is a giant. There's so many people that have made this stuff happen. Thank you so much to all of you for all that you do.
And thank you so much, Ken.
And I'll just go ahead and say empowerourfuture.org in case anybody does not know where it is. And by the way, Ken, Bill Althouse was on the call and said thank you. Appreciated being
I
acknowledged.
appreciate Bill. Bill's a hoot.
Really appreciate you, Ken. Thank you so much for being our guest. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much. And have a great night, everybody.